Coming up today, feeling better after coming down with a mild illness. President Park Geun-hye returned to work today and she had some strong words over a recently agreed reform to the public workers' pension system. The record low key interest rate is encouraging Koreans to borrow more, adding to the household debt mountain that has been growing after 3 rounds of rate cuts in less than a year. Plus, Korean golfer Park Inbee storms to her second season victory on the LPGA Tour. She now has 14 tour titles to her name. Stay tuned for these stories and more. Hello, it's noon on Monday the 4th of May. You're tuned in to our midday newscast here on Arirang TV. Thanks as always for joining us. I'm Mark Broome. Our top story this afternoon, Korea's rival parties have agreed on a bill to reform the pension system for public servants, but the two sides look set to clash over possible changes to the national pension system. Now, before we get into that, lawmakers agreed on Saturday to pass the public servant pension reform bill at the National Assembly on this coming Wednesday. Under the revisions, civil servants will pay more each month but receive less when they retire. This will save the government well over $300 billion over the next 70 years. However, the agreement on the pension plan came as a package deal between the rival parties. In this trade-off deal, the main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy will get the opportunity to include the agenda of reforming the national pension system during an assembly session in September. A number of ruling party lawmakers have already raised their objections. President Park Geun-hye returned to work earlier today after taking a week off due to illness. At a meeting of her senior secretary, she took note of the fact that Korea's ruling and main opposition parties met the May 2nd deadline to agree on the revised public employee pension bill. The president, however, expressed regret over how the agreed reforms are only expected to reduce the financial burden on the future generations. She also raised concerns about the party's trade-off deal to revise the national pension plan without public approval. President Park, who had said 2 pardons granted to Jongun, a deceased businessman at the center of a very high-profile bribery scandal, should be investigated. And she added that a president's right to grant a pardon should be systematically reviewed. So, how much does a public servant in Korea get paid per year? A survey of 970,000 officials by the Ministry of Government Administration and Home Affairs shows that last year, the average official was paid approximately $52,000 a year, that is before taxes, and that's around $4,300 a month, a 4.5% increase from the previous year. The survey included public servants at the lowest ranking all the way up to the highest senior officials, including the Prime Minister. Korea logged yet another current account surplus in March and is poised to set a new record streak for month-on-month surpluses. But there are concerns the surplus trend is increasingly due to slowing imports, suggesting domestic consumption is drying up. Our Kim Min-ji reports.
Korea posted a current account surplus for the 37th straight month in March. The Bank of Korea says preliminary data shows the surplus hit almost $10.4 billion, up nearly 42% from the same month last year. The figure marks the highest level since a record $11.3 billion surplus in November in 2014. At this rate, Korea is likely to break its previous record surplus streak of 38 months, which started back in June 1986. The balance of goods rose to over $11 billion last month, up from about $7.3 billion in February, as inbound shipments shrank at a faster rate than exports due to low global oil prices. Exports fell 8.4% to nearly $50 billion, while imports plunged almost 17% to $38 billion. It did slow from last month, but tumbling exports coupled with a drop in imports points to a current account surplus trend that mainly stems from sluggish domestic demand. The nation's accumulated current account surplus for the first quarter of the year totaled over $23 billion, up from about $15 billion last year. The central bank expects the current account surplus to hit a record high of $96 billion for the whole year. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Now, most of us were happy with a bit of pocket money when we were children, but for the top 1%, things work a little differently. The top 7 stock-rich kids in Korea own shares worth more than $18 million each, and all of them are the grandchildren of Im Sung-gi, the founder and CEO of Hanmi Pharmaceuticals. Data released by local conglomerate tracker Chaebol.com shows there are over 120 children at or under the age of 12 who have shares worth at least $92,000 in their name. That's just 5 fewer than the 126 children a year ago, which was the highest number on record. The number of stock-rich children surpassed 100 for the first time in April 2012. Most of them are either given or they inherit stocks from their conglomerate controlling parents or relatives. Now, Korea's historically low interest rate has prompted many Koreans to borrow more, and they're using most of the money for housing purchases. And experts say the increase in borrowing is due to the country's record low key interest rate of 1.75%, and they expect the borrowing trend to continue for some time to come. Shin Se-min reports.
Korean households borrowed nearly $487 billion in March, an increase of $3.7 billion from the previous month. Korea's Financial Supervisory Service says that's their largest margin of growth in the 9 years since it started collecting the data, and it attributed the rise to the country's record low key interest rate of 1.75%. The majority of loans were home loans. There were over 13,000 housing transactions in March, up by nearly 50% from the previous month, and that was just in Seoul. This is in line with the previous worries that the low-key interest rate is only stoking household debt, prompting buyers to borrow more. Korea's total household debt rose over $500 billion in February from the month before, surpassing the 1,000 trillion won mark, or $950 billion last year. Experts say that while the borrowing speed is worrisome, it is a phase the economy has to endure.
Household debt is an all-time high, and that may lead to a long-term depression, just like it did with the Japanese economy. But revitalizing the Korean economy, such as through the housing market, is much more urgent.
Saying that the borrowing trend will likely continue for some time, he added that more fixed-rate mortgage-backed loans like the government's relief loans are needed. The program introduced by the Financial Service Commission in March helps debtors to repay their loans over a longer period of time. Experts say programs like these are one way the government may be able to strike a balance between controlling household debt and reviving the economy by fueling private spending. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
An American scientist says South Korea is capable of developing its own nuclear weapons within 5 years to cope with North Korea's nuclear arsenal, or if Japan decides to go nuclear. Charles Ferguson, president of the Federation of American Scientists, said in a report last week that if the US was perceived as being unable to reliably counter the threats posed by China and North Korea and Japan, well, South Korea would want to take steps, he says, to have their own nuclear capabilities. He says South Korea is currently capable of making 2,500 kilograms of near-weapons-grade plutonium, or enough to make more than 400 bombs from 4 pressurized heavy water reactors at its Walsong nuclear power plant. He added that Seoul also has the potential to make dozens of nuclear warheads every year from its near-weapons-grade plutonium within a 5-year period. An investigation is underway into a South Korean college student who is known to have been detained in North Korea for illegal entry. The South Korean government says it's working to fact-check the details of Jongun's detainment. Now, Ju is a 21-year-old New York University student who, according to Pyongyang, was arrested on April 22nd for illegally crossing into North Korea from China via the Yalu River. Now, it's still not known why Ju had attempted to enter North Korea in this way. His parents were reportedly only aware that their son was going on a trip to China. Ju's detention brings the current number of South Korean nationals held in the north to 4. Now, not much is known about North Korean leader Kim Jongun as a man, but an American journalist has described him as a cunning but rational figure. Blaine Harden, who wrote Escape from Camp 14, the biography of a North Korean defector, told CNN that the young leader is acting to preserve his power over the long term. Harden was referring to reports that Kim recently ordered the execution of 15 senior officials. He said Kim resembles his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who was also quick to purge those who tried to challenge him. Now, with a key World War II anniversary on the horizon, Germany is sending a strong message of repentance for its wartime past. Chancellor Angela Merkel is calling on German citizens to remain sensitive to the damage the Nazis caused during the war. This, of course, is in marked contrast to the actions of Japan's Prime Minister, who has used ambiguous remarks to avoid acknowledging his country's wartime atrocities. Son Jung-in reports.
In a speech commemorating the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp on Sunday, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said the death camps stand as an everlasting reminder of the brutality committed by the Nazis during World War II.
No, we will never forget. We'll not forget for the sake of the victims, for our own sake, and for the sake of future generations.
Merkel, who in 2013 became the first German leader to visit Dachau, condemned the hostility against Jewish people that still prevail in the country.
Anti-Semitism affects the inviolable and inalienable dignity of man, and thus the basis of our free, democratic constitutional system.
Members of Germany's Jewish community said the chancellor's presence at the ceremony alongside the survivors of Dachau concentration camp was a sign of solidarity.
Her visit gives Jewish people hope for the future, with her positive thinking in mind.
On the eve of the ceremony, Merkel stressed that German citizens have a special responsibility to be aware of what was done by the German people during the Nazi era. The country is holding a series of events this week to honor fallen soldiers and pay tribute to victims of the war. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
Now, what has been described as one of the biggest missions of its kind so far this year, nearly 6,000 migrants were rescued off the Libyan coast over the weekend. The Italian Coast Guard says the migrants from countries like Sudan, Libya, Somalia, Eritrea and Ethiopia were picked up from dangerously overloaded wooden and rubber boats in well over a dozen separate operations by Italian and French ships. Those migrants have since been taken to Italy, and rescue missions in the Mediterranean are ongoing. Around 1,800 people have died this year alone trying to cross the sea, a 20-fold increase from the same period in 2014. Now, the already impressive trophy cabinet of Korean golfer Park Geun-hye has swelled even further as she stormed to her second victory of the LPGA season. The world number 2 won by 3 strokes after finishing 15 under par overall on Sunday at the LPGA Tour's North Texas Shootout. Christy Kerr and Park Hyung tied for second. Now, this is Park Geun-hye's 14th LPGA Tour title. After sealing this victory, Park said she felt her ball striking was solid all week and her putting was back to its best. World number 1 Lydia Ko tied at 41st on even par despite her rather disappointing performance. Ko remains at number 1. Now, spring is the season for flowers, and some of them are making their way onto dining tables in Korea. These edible flowers are not just extremely pretty to look at, they're also filled with nutrients that are very good for our body. Won Ji-yeon tells us more.
Spring is here, and it's being served on a plate. With seasonal flowers in full bloom, more people are trying to get a taste of spring by adding edible flowers to classic Korean dishes. For instance, the flavors of this bibimbap were taken to a whole new level with the addition of edible flowers. Soy sauce was used instead of traditional red pepper paste, which helped bring out the bittersweetness of the flower petals. And many diners agree that the flowers are a treat for the eyes and the palate.
The flowers are almost too pretty to eat, but they're delicious and I feel healthier after eating them.
Some of the most common edible flowers in springtime are pansies, begonias, and geraniums. And restaurant owners like Ko Seok-gu make sure that the flowers are safe to eat.
We make sure these flowers are grown organically. We only give them soil and nothing else, not even fertilizer. Since they're grown naturally, they're filled with healthy nutrients.
Edible flowers are not just great for brightening up a dish, they're also good for the body. In fact, scientists have found loads of antioxidants in approximately 20 different flowers that are used as food in Korea. The flowers are also packed with proteins, vitamins, and minerals. But despite the health benefits, flower consumption should not be taken lightly. Scientists warn that some flowers are toxic, and even the edible ones can cause severe allergic reactions. Won Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Well, those are the stories we have for you at this hour. Hope your week gets off to a wonderful start. Goodbye.